Hi, I'm Adam Summer. You're listening to the Yerushalmi Talk podcast with the support of the Yeshivat Javar Yerushalayim in Har Nof, Jerusalem. This is Peah, chapter 8, Halacha 4, and this is a really interesting one. Now, you're gonna come along and you're gonna say, okay, well, Meiser Ani is guaranteed, a couple of times in the Torah, and it's mentioned in Devarim and in 14:28, and it's mentioned later in Devarim 26:12, and it's saying, "You shall give," and it's commanding this of you shall give. Can be when the farmer distributes it from his house, or to give can imply that the giver has you know control over an area of processing, and or it could be directly from the field, even if the farmer has no control over processing and distribution. So it can be in any one of these areas. Now, the Mishnah is going to talk about Meiser Ani distributed at the threshing floor in the field, and now it's going to say, well, the obvious question. Well, like so many questions that we have in the Shas, what is the minimum quantity? Many times we want to know is there a minimum quantity? Is there a maximum quantity? That's how this first Mishnah in Peah, chapter 1, Halacha 1, starts out, that there's no, minimum or maximum quantity. And now, so, that's a trend that's always in the Shas. And it's no different here. So now you're going to say, what is the minimum amount of Meiser Ani? How much are you supposed to give? So let's say a single poor person comes over and you have lots of it. You don't want to give it all to one person. You want to distribute it to a few people. What's the minimum amount you're allowed to give them? Okay, you don't feel like giving them all of it. Just like you have, your own, Meiser money in your house and you distribute it to the poor, you're not obligated to give all your Meiser money to one person. You want to give a little bit. So same thing here. What's a little bit of Meiser Ani? Okay, maybe you have 10 poor people who just came to you at the threshing floor, and what, you're going to give all to one person and leave the other people with nothing? No, you want to spread it out. No problem. What's that minimum amount that you have to give? What is it? How does it work? Mishnah says like this. Again, we're talking about minimum amount that each poor person receives. It says, one may not give the poor at the threshing floor less than a half kav of wheat or a kav of barley. And Rabbi Meir says a half kav of barley. Now, this is really, really packed with detail. And it's so you say, well, wait a second. Why would it be that you would have a half kav for wheat and a kav for barley? Why would you be saying now with Rabbi Meir saying no, it would be the same as the kav of wheat? And the idea that we see here is a half kav of wheat is going to be enough for 2 meals. In the time of the Mishnah and the time of the Gemara, people would eat 2 meals a day. And a kav of barley would basically be enough for 2 meals. You can shuck it and stew it. You can grind it, and basically, what's interesting about this is that you have this difference in the Tanna Kama are saying half a kav of wheat and a kav of barley, and the reason that they're saying more barley than wheat for this 2 meal requirement is going to be that the Tana is going to be talking about inferior barley that has a much higher waste content than wheat, so that if you gave a kav of wheat, a barley, and then you went up and processed it, what you'd be left with ends up with being the same amount of a half kav of barley of wheat, which would end up having the same amount of volume for 2 meals. So everywhere here, you're going to be getting into saying the minimum is corresponding to 2 meals. And now if you're giving something that volumetrically is going to be bigger, there's going to be a lot of waste product to get it down to that 2-meal measure. And that's why you have that inconsistency. Now, Rabbi Meir comes up with the minimum amount of barley and wheat. And so what could that be? So really, this is going to be having where there's no dispute between the Tanakama and Rabbi Meir. The Tanakama, we're talking about a kav of barley, is talking about bad quality, inferior quality barley. So that the reason that Rebbe put this in here is so you know that, if it's not just an amount, it's an amount that after processing, you're ending up with the same amount that leaves 2 meals, so that you have to add a greater quantity. That's why Rebbe's putting this in here. And they're also putting in, Rabbi Meir's point, because if you have a very, very high quality barley that doesn't need processing, and you could take out just as much as you would for also a half calf of wheat, and you'd be left either with this very high quality barley or this regular quality wheat, you would end up with the same quantity, and then you would say, it's going to be a half calf of barley. Always the quantity is going to be, okay, you have to have enough for 2 meals. And so in this case by Rabbi Meir, there's no disagreement at all between the Tanakama. What they're merely saying is that in one case you're having bad quality barley that requires that you have a lot of loss from processing, and the other is a very, very, very high grade barley where there's just as much loss as with the wheat, and that would also be a half calf, and there's no disagreement. The Tanakama is going to continue. Now it says, similarly, one may not give less than a calf and a half of spelt, and a calf of dried figs, or a manna of pressed figs. And Rabbi Akiva says a pras. So you have a dispute now perhaps between Rabbi Akiva and a pras, by the way, is a half a manna. And it would look like Rabbi Akiva agrees with the Tanakama that the dried figs required a minimum of a calf. But the pressed figs, he says, is a minimum of a pras, which is half the amount required by the Tanakama. So what it looks like is it's saying that on the calf and a half of spelt and the calf of dried figs, that there's no disagreement between the Tanakama and Rabbi Akiva. But in terms of the pressed figs, that's where you have a question. Rabbi Moshe Feinstein says that in his Beur that most people use spelt only when it's finely sifted, and the poor must be given 3 times as much spelt as wheat to equal 2 meals worth. Because again, you're ending up with a lot of loss. And so to make up to it, you have to have 3 times that amount. So of the 3 types of grain that you have, 5 types of grain, you have wheat, barley, spelt, oats, and rye, like what we're talking about in Masechet Challah, and what can become matzah, and what become leaven in 18 minutes. The Mishnah here is talking about 3. So you say to yourself, well, where's oats and rye? So that would be, Rabbi Moshe Feinstein says that would be treated like barley, which could be considered a variety of barley. In other words, the Gemara in Masechet Challah in chapter 1 is gonna say that oats and rye are like types of barley. And so basically you can find in this all 5 types of the grain that becomes leaven. And so it's really not missing, says Rabbi Moshe Feinstein. It's a very good insight, and it's a very good way to look at it. Now, let's get into this idea about the pressed figs. So what they're trying to say is that a calf is a unit of volume, while a manna is a measure of weight. And they're saying that it was customary to sell dried figs by volume, but when they were pressed into round cakes, it's sold by weight. And this is going to account for the different units of measurement in this Mishnah, says the Rosh. And so, one way to look at it is you're saying that, this is a minimum amount of fresh, moist, figs, and the other is going to be, dried out figs. So then you say, well, what's going on with this pras, which is half a manna? And, so the Tosfot on Shem comments that it would appear that Rabbi Akiva agrees with the Tanna Kama that dried figs required the minimum of a kav, but on the pressed figs he maintains the minimum of a pras, which is half the amount that the Tanna Kama say. So that's going to be a disagreement that we're going to get into in a little bit. And then there's another dispute between the Tanna Kama and Rabbi Akiva, and it says that one may not give less than a half log of wine. And Rabbi Akiva says a quarter of a log. And why would that be? So the Rambam is going to comment on the Mishnah and say that this refers to uncooked wine, and the half log minimum is based on the fact that at times a person can have nothing more during an entire day than a quarter log of uncooked wine in the morning and another quarter log in the evening, and nonetheless feel satisfied. So this is how the Rambam is understanding this, and so he's saying that the half log could be a case where he doesn't have food, but he's drinking enough in the day for the say the afternoon and the evening, or the morning and the afternoon, where he can end up being satisfied, and even without food he would be okay. So that could be an explanation. Then you have a third dispute, and it says that one may not give less than a quarter of a log of oil, and Rabbi Akiva says an eighth of a log. And for all of these items, the landowner must give each person 2 meals worth when he comes to collect Meiser and from the field. So why do you have this disagreement here? And the Meiri is going to say that oil is not consumed alone; it is unhealthy, and rather it is used as a condiment for bread. And a quarter log is a minimum set by the Tanna Kama to be enough to accompany 2 meals of bread. In other words, as basically using the oil as a dipping sauce. Okay, it could be that you become so poor that you're at the point where you're eating bread, oil, and salt. And this, says the Tanna Kama, is the minimum amount a person needs of the oil to serve as a dipping thing to be part of a meal. So the point by Rabbi Akiva says, what it says in Shari Amuna is that Rabbi Akiva sets the minimum amount of pressed figs, wine, and oil at half the amount by the Tanna Kama, and he's apparently assessing the smallest quantity of these items of which a person could make 2 meals if he was forced to do so. And the Shari Amuna explains that the Tanna Kama, however, assesses the minimum amount according to the practice of someone who makes 2 meals out of any of these items by choice, such that a person allows himself more food. In other words, Tanna Kama is saying that if you had the choice to eat olive oil and bread, this is the amount that you would do. And effectively what the Shari Amuna is pointing out is Rabbi Akiva's measurement is saying that if you had to survive, at the very, very minimum, this would be the amount. The Tanna Kama is coming along saying that might be fine, that this would be the amount, but we want the person to at least feel satisfied. And if he's going to feel satisfied and he's going to feel, like a mensch, not like a poor schlub, but he's going to feel like a mensch with himself, here's the amount. That's really what the Shari Amuna explains for this difference. And then the Mishnah finishes up and says, regarding all other produce, it's enough that he can sell them and buy with their proceeds food for 2 meals. In other words, what's the amount of food for Meiser Ani as the minimum? Enough to get 2 meals. That's the point. So in the Derech Amuna, it's going to point out about this part by Abba Shaul that in the case of other foods which are not used regularly, such as complete meals or condiments with bread, the minimum portion of Meiser Ani distributed in the field must be a quantity equivalent in value to 2 meals. So this would enable a poor person to sell the tithe and buy 2 meals with the money. So now the Gemara wants to get into this Meiser Ani distribution in the field. The Baraisa teaches the minimum amounts to be distributed as Meiser Ani in the field: a quarter kav of rice, a kula of spices, a litra of vegetables, 3 calves of carobs, a half log of wine, a quarter log of olive oil, 10 nuts, 5 peaches, 2 pomegranates, and 1 etrog. And all of these measurements represent the amount needed for 2 meals. So whether it's going to be the amount of spices you need as a condiment for 2 meals, uh, what what could those be? It could be a little bit of cumin, or how much rice is going to satisfy you. Um, this is going to be, you know, this is going to be the amount of rice that's going to satisfy you for 2 meals. And that's going to be different, by the way, than the amount of wheat that's going to be needed for 2 meals. The amount of wheat, could be, you could make it into a porridge, or you could make it into pita breads. But the amount of rice that you need is going to be less than that. So it's unlikely you're going to be making rice breads. The Kuthians did that kind of stuff, but normally you would just cook the rice. And then you're going to be talking about, these other things like carobs, and because they're inferior, you need a larger amount, needed to make up these 2 meals. It's always coming back with, what do you need, to do that. So in the case of nuts, nuts, those are normally used as dessert, and these amounts would be enough to serve as dessert for 2 meals. These are not 2 meals as meals. These are using these as dessert. Same would be for the peaches, the pomegranates, and the etrogs. These are the amount needed, not as food as your basic meal, but as what you would be using for dessert. And the Gemara is going to seek a source for this law. Wants to know where do you get this from? How do you know 2 meals? And is that going to be deraita? And Yerushalmi is going to come along and say, yes, it is deraita, and we know it's from the Torah. From the Torah, this is a deraita thing of the 2 meals. Here's how it proves, this source of the law, where the Gemara says, what is the source for this ruling that one must give 2 meals worth of produce as Meiser Ani? And the Gemara is going to answer, and it's going to say from Devarim 26:12. So this is a deraita thing that the sages have, that this is a real thing. This is not made up by the rabbis. Here's what it says. It says, they shall eat within your gates and be satisfied. In other words, what this is saying, says the Gemara, says, give him enough to satisfy him. So that is a deraita thing. How much do you give in talking about the Meiser Ani is enough to satisfy him. That's what the Torah says. Now, you have to give him enough to satisfy him. So basically, what Rabbi Moshe Feinstein says, he's saying that the verse teaches that each poor person must be given enough Meiser Ani to satisfy him. And this, by the way, is saying that, the norm was to eat 2 meals a day, and the minimum amount to give to a poor person where he should be satisfied twice in one day. Okay, so this is a really amazing insight about the sensitivity of the Torah. That it's not just saying, hey, here's 1 nut, goodbye, good luck, get out of here. It's saying that, no, it wants the poor person to have some dignity where he came out there and he has enough to make a meal for a day, a couple of meals for a day. You can eat for the day. He came out, he took his time to come out for the day. He didn't go to work. He came out to gather the grain. No problem. You have to give him an amount for the day. He took the day to come. You got to give him enough for the day. You can't give him less than that. Why would that be? That would be cruel, because then he spent the time and he came out for the day, and you gave him less than his value of his time to come out for the day. He could have gone and done something else. So he didn't even get enough calories to be satisfied for that day. You're really pressing on the poor person that way if you're giving less, because he came out this way and he didn't even get enough to cover his day of effort to come. And really, in that way, it would be denigrating what the Torah is. The Torah guarantees these gifts to satisfy the poor person, and you're really pressing on the poor person. He came out, spent the day to do it, and you're not even giving him enough for the time of the day. You want to give more, that's fine, but the minimum, you got to at least cover his time for the day. And look how clever the Chachamim are. The Gemara seeks the source for the amounts listed in the various foods. And Rabbi Hiskia asks his father, from where do we know these amounts? And Hiskia's father changes the subject. He said to Hiskia, with this stone, support this cypress tree so that it should not fall. So the Mara Fulda is saying that Hiskia's father had no interest in entering into a discussion regarding the matter, perhaps due to the fact that these accounts were known as a tradition and any hypothesis regarding their source would only be a speculation. And Rabbi Kanievsky in his Beur series says as follows. He's saying that he explains that just as it is possible for a small stone to play a significant role in supporting an entire structure, so too, when you have peaches that can serve as an appetizer or dessert, and 5 are sufficient for 2 meals worth. Thus, a small amount can support an entire meal. So the Rosh Cirilio is explaining it that Hiskia's father is offering an analogy about how a small amount can be considered provisions for 2 meals. In other words, you're trying to support, just like trying to support this structure, it's trying to use this analogy that you're also trying to support a structure so it doesn't fall over. And that's how you have to look at supporting the poor, like a structure that you don't want to fall over. So that's a deep Agadic insight that in thinking about helping the poor, that you have to consider it like a structure that you don't want to fall over. So the Gemara is going to tell a related incident. Rabbi Hanania was sitting before Rabbi Eli, and Rabbi Eli stated the basis for these amounts, and Rabbi Hanania refuted them. And Rabbi Eli stated other sources, and Rabbi Hanania refuted them. And Rabbi Eli said to Rabbi Hanania, it is not proper to always refute, rather to support. So the Mara Fulda, he's explaining the verse like this. He's saying that just like a bathhouse keeper does not demolish but rather builds, so too nothing positive will come from your questions besides denying us of any possible explanation as the source of these amounts. And the purpose of a question must be to attain a better understanding of the subject. And a question that does not lead to that goal is worthless. And others explain it as a vowelization thing, where balan is going to be an abridged form of bahalin, which is that it's gonna says the Pnei Moshe, the reason is that I gave are not subject to your refutations. On the contrary, since these amounts are based on tradition, even a seemingly weak reason as to their origin suffices. So that really what is trying to point out in this is that this is a tradition, and this is part of the Matzorah and how we know it. By the way, part of this Matzorah is going to be that always to support this structure so that the cypress tree doesn't fall down. And that, by the way, is probably what Hiskia was saying when what his father was saying to Hiskia, which was that he didn't directly answer it. He's saying is enough so that the structure doesn't fall down, and that corresponds to this idea of satisfy him enough, give him enough to satisfy him. And we can't name the amount. We can just say that this is part of the tradition. So the other insight that I think Mara Fulda has, that I think is really deep for our Torah learning, is that when we pose a question, that it needs to give us a better understanding of the subject. And if we're posing a question that does not lead to the goal of a better understanding of the subject, then we should regard it as a worthless question. So that's there's a lot of clues in the Shas about how to learn better. And really what it's trying to say is it's trying to say that if you're going to be asking a question, you should be trying to do it in a way that you're going to get a better understanding of the subject. And if you're not, then you should disregard it, and it's a worthless waste of time. So the Brisa now is going to dispute the ruling about the vegetables. And Rabbi Mana said it was taught in a Brisa 4 liters of vegetables is a minimum amount for Meiser Ani. So there is going to be a mention of that. And here's what the Pnei Moshe says. The Pnei Moshe is going to be saying that the Brisa taught that 1 liter of vegetables is sufficient. Rabbi Mana cites a dissenting Brisa that requires 4 liters. So according to Rosh Cirilio, the reading here could be moist figs, which is neither dried nor pressed, and that would be 4 liters. So that might be another way to try to understand this. And the Mishnah now is gonna cite a dispute with regard to the minimum amount of wine distributed as Meiser Ani. The Tana Kama requires half a log, while Rabbi Akiva maintains a quarter of log. And this Gemara is going to apply to the laws of the Eruv Tehumim. So, by the way, so for this kind of Eruv, this is where you put it down on Shabbat so you can go 2,000 amos from your dwelling. So it's interesting that this is going to correspond to the to the Eruv Tehum, which is the limit of how far you can go on Shabbat. It's interesting that this connects together. In other words, a lot of times in the halachas, you'll see related things connect together, and it's interesting that this minimum amount is also going to be used for this Eruv. Very, very cool, and very deep way to understand it in a much richer way. So Rabbi Lazar said, and similarly, this amount of wine is needed for an Eruv. So also, the amount of wine that you need to create this Eruv. This would also be this amount if you're going to start to join together, courtyards, and you're going to, extend your limit to how far you can travel on Shabbat. Very interesting. It's connected. The Gemara is going to limit Rabbi Elazar's statement, and the Gemara says Rabbi Hanina said this was stated only regarding wine, but regarding oil, we may make an Eruv with it in the amount of food for 2 meals. So Rabbi Moshe Feinstein explains it as follows from his Beur. He says that the amount of oil eaten in 2 meals, that's what this is saying. Apparently this is less than a revis. And this quantity, however, does not suffice for Meiser Ani, since it would not be worthwhile for a poor person to make his way to the field for such a small amount. And having applied the ruling of the Mishnah to this Eruv law, the Gemara is going to elaborate on the various foods that are valid for this Eruv. And the Brisa taught we may make an Eruv with vinegar in the amount of food for 2 meals. And the Gemara explains Rabbi Yirmiyah in the name of Rabbi Shmuel bar Yitzchak. This means enough to dip bound vegetables for 2 meals. So what does that mean? That, vinegar was normally used as a dip, and therefore the amount of vinegar is based on the amount needed to dip 2 meals worth of vegetables in it. And the Gemara is talking about bound vegetables because it was common to dip vegetables in this manner and a way to flavor it. So this would be what it's related to. And the Gemara now is going to talk about another ruling relating to the Eruv. And it says Rabbi Yitzchak of Atyusha said before Rabbi Zera in the name of the Academy of Rabbi Yanai, regarding raw peas, we may make an Eruv with them using the amount of food needed for 2 meals. And the Gemara elaborates on this ruling. From whom is this ruling needed? For Rabbi Meir, who rules that one may not use an onion which is not eaten alone raw for an Eruv. And it was needed to teach that Rabbi Meir agrees that one may not use raw peas as an Eruv. so that you shall not say that since peas cause a foul odor in the mouth, one does not generally eat them raw alone, and thus one may not make an Eruv with them. Rabbi Yitzhak of Yusha teaches that they are nonetheless eaten, and Rabbi Meir agrees that they may be used as an Eruv. So this is this, by the way, is going to be a source by a ruling by Rabbi Avadia Yosef. Rabbi Avadia Yosef was asked about brushing the teeth on Shabbat. This is a Sephardi only ruling for the people who are only following the Shita of Rabbi Avadia Yosef. But Rabbi Avadia Yosef said that it's embarrassing to, and you kind of don't want to feel shame or embarrassed for having bad breath, and that he's using this because this is a food that would cause a bad odor in the mouth if you're eating it raw, and so that after the fact, fine, maybe Rabbi Meir agrees that it could be used as an Eruv, but you shouldn't really be using this as an Eruv because it's going to give you bad breath. And you feel bad about it. You feel embarrassed on Shabbat. You're supposed to oneg Shabbat. And you're not in a way to oneg Shabbat with bad smelly breath where you're offending everybody. And so Rabbi Avadia Yosef was using this as a ruling that Sephardi only can brush their teeth on Shabbat for the same reason. So again, that's Sephardi only who are following Rabbi Avadia Yosef, and that's not all Sephardi. And it's definitely not Ashkenaz or Hasidim. So the Gemara is going to continue its discussion of food that may be used for an Eruv. And it says that one may make an Eruv using salted fish, one may make an Eruv using salted meat, raw meat may be used as well, as we learned in the Mishnah regarding the he-goat of Yom Kippur. When Yom Kippur fell on a Friday, the Babylonians would eat it after the fast when it was still raw, because they are of perverse sensibilities. In other words, since some people would eat raw meat, it can be used as an Eruv. There's always a case in the Yerushalmi where the Yerushalmi always looks down on the people of Bavel, always, not only in scholarship but also in manners and in sensibilities. So this is a similar case to that, and basically the Babylonian Kohanim would eat sacrificial meat raw in this kind of year, and most people are normally repulsed by it. The Kohanim over in Bavel are not, and the people who are refined sensibilities like in Eretz Yisrael would never do that in this year. This is really something where this is being used as a euphemism for somebody who eats raw meat as being somebody who's unrefined versus somebody who's refined, and somebody who in their normal way of doing things does things in a gross, revolting way, but because it's done as a tradition over there, it can be done. Now, I want to point out that in the Yerushalmi, raw meat is not valid for an Eruv. Okay, not only would it not be valid for an Eruv in Eretz Yisrael, it probably wouldn't be valid because the Yerushalmi probably is talking about Eretz Yisrael. But the Yerushalmi would probably agree that over there, Chutz La'aretz, for these people that are less refined, it would be okay for them to do it if they're in Chutz La'aretz. But if those same people came to Eretz Yisrael, they would not be allowed to make an Eruv out of it, because you have to accompany you have to go with the minhagim of the place that you go to, and so that if everybody wasn't doing it and you're doing something that even in Bavel was normal, and it would be considered to be strange or repulsive here and cast an eye on it, you're not allowed to do it. So it would be fine Chutz La'aretz, and it's one of these Yerushalmis that's pointing out the difference between the behaviors of people outside of Israel and the behaviors of the Jews that are in Israel. So the Gemara now is going to talk about a related issue. Rabbi Yudan concluded regarding the kalkira, since the Kuthians eat it raw, one may make an Eruv with it, just as raw meat is valid for an Eruv, since the Babylonians eat raw meat. So again, this is talking about um, if you're over in Bavel, can you go do this if this is the way it's done over there? Yes, it's a valid Eruv. It's not the case of an Eruv that's invalid. But if you're coming over here, it's going to be it's not the way it's done. Okay, so can you use it as a valid Eruv? People are going to scratch their head. Over here, now it's talking about another case of the Kuthians doing it. There are a lot of readings about this kind of herb. What is this kind of herb? Some people might even say that it's a kind of fish that's not eaten raw, unless you're Japanese and you like your sushi. But this is this could be a kind of fish that's not normally raw. It could be a kind of vegetable that's not normally raw. There, by the way, are vegetables that you have to cook, and you can't eat them raw. Rhubarb, by the way, is one of those. If you don't process it and cook it, it actually is poisonous. So in this case, all the Rishonim are agreeing that whatever this is by the Kuthians, that it's a food that's not normally eaten raw. So the Rosh Cirilio is understanding that the Gemara is presenting a question which is not resolved, so that this could be a case where Rabbi Yudan is saying that, yeah, the Kuthians can do it, but just like with the Babylonians over there, that they can do it, if they're coming over to this area, it would not be valid, but it is valid if you're a Kuthian doing it over there. This gets into part of the dispute. Are Kuthians Jewish or not? There was a time when some of the people considered that they were, and then there was a later time when a lot of the people, including Rabban Shimon Gamliel, said that they were not Jewish. This could be a time when they were considered to be Jewish. And the Gemara is going to conclude the discussion of the items that may be used for an Eruv. Shmuel bar Shilas said in the name of Rav regarding Papuin, Gudgedanios, and Chalugos, we may make an Eruv with them. These, by the way, are the terms of these crops that we're not sure of, and there's reference to it a couple of times in the Bavli and the Yerushalmi Shas about what these terms are in the Tanakh, and we see Rebbe's housekeeper actually referred to one of these, and then we knew what it was, and the Gemara is now going to identify what these herbs are. Okay, so this is another case where they identify these. These are mentioned in the Tanakh. It's unclear what these are, but here's what it'll be. By the way, they agree that you may use these for an Eruv, and the Gemara is going to identify the herbs. They inquired of Shmuel bar Shilas, what are these? And Shmuel bar Shilas replied, he said to them, kukuli, coriander, and purslane, respectively. So, according to the Marafulda, kuklin is an inexpensive herb, and the translation of the last two are based on Rashi and Eruvin 28a. So, just want to point out that this minimum measure that you have for Meiser Ani is deeply connected in structure to the Eruv that you make for Shabbat, and where it's connected to trying to come up with how far you can go, or connecting courtyards. And it's really interesting that the halacha parallels and connects to it. And I think that it's really interesting. Now it's interesting. Vilna Gaon points out with this reading in the Yerushalmi that regarding the vegetables, that they are eaten in 2 meals, and that, by the way, is gonna conform with the reading of the Bavli. So again, over here for the Eruv, you're doing it where this is going to correspond to 2 meals over here, and this is going to correspond to 2 meals over here for Meiser Ani, how much you have to give, because again, it goes to this idea of support. The Amorim are saying that the support and satisfy is Doraita, and that this idea of satisfy, which is Doraita from Meiser Ani, would also be connected to satisfy as a Gezerah Shaba for the Eruv, for what you're going to need to create a different boundary on Shabbat. Thank you so much.